Hello and welcome to the 300th episode of The Actor and the Engineer. My name is Paul James and I am the actor.
My name is Josh Knapp. I'm the broadcast engineer.
Here we go, Josh. Wow.
300 episodes. Well, congratulations, first of all.
Same to you, buddy. Well, the first thing I wanted to say was part of my introduction. I was going to say, and I'm super proud to be part of this podcast, but I was so afraid to say all of that one time that I cut it. And so I am super proud to be your podcast partner, and I'm super proud of what we've accomplished, and I'm just super proud. And I feel like we've done something. 300.
Yeah.
300. That's a lot.
Well, the feeling is mutual. And I think that, first of all, I mean, it's a big number. It's a big, nice, round, fat number, 300. And then also, we're going to be releasing this episode right around the time of our 7th anniversary. And so that's huge too. And don't do the math of like, we haven't actually released an episode every week, but that's okay. We've still done 300 episodes. So I'm super proud of that. And if you go back and listen to our earlier episodes, I think they're definitely interesting and something that is worth listening to. But I think that we've kind of honed whatever we have here to the point where we're at right now. And so I think that's probably a good thing, considering that we're taking on the behemoth task of talking about one of the most prolific and celebrated directors in American cinema, well, in world cinema, really, in Spike Lee. And it's a pretty daunting task. In fact, we were talking about before we started the episode that we both felt underprepared. But I don't know if there's ever going to be a time where we're going to be completely prepared, because he's just so prolific. Like, just going through the number of projects that he's been a part of and the number of projects that he's produced, directed, written. I mean, it's huge. He has this compendium of work that runs the gamut. I mean, he's directed 23 feature films, and that's not even talking about all of the documentaries that he's done. He's done some TV movies. He's done commercials. He's done a bunch of stuff that it would just be impossible to talk about in a single episode. So I think we're going to try our best to kind of go through each of our favorite things from his career, and things that we think are interesting and things that we think are definitely worth bringing up and pulling to the forefront. And then hopefully trying to determine what are the things that make him unique as a filmmaker and as an artist, and all the things that we think are just super cool.
The thing that I noticed the most when I was doing my research, and I've seen quite a few of his films, and I saw quite a few of his movies for this podcast, a couple I hadn't seen before and some that I had seen before. What I've noticed is, what can't he do? Or what hasn't he done? He has commercials that are in the zeitgeist of our world. He has major motion pictures that he has Oscars for, and people have Oscar nominations for, and he has a Cannes Film Festival Award too, I believe. He has Emmys. What hasn't he done? He has created some of the most interesting music videos that are out there. Stuff that is just touchstones of the society at that time, but they have grown and lived on. So what hasn't he done? He has filmed Broadway shows. He has filmed theater productions. I think the only thing he hasn't done is actually direct a Broadway show. And watch, this time next year, he'll be in production for his first Broadway production. Now, he is not a theater director. His medium is film, but he is definitely a great film director of theater. So yeah, I was pretty proud. I think he has 23, you said 23 feature films. I've seen 17 of them.
Wow, I've only seen 11.
And 4 of the other things that I've seen, which are not considered feature films, obviously, is David Byrne's American Utopia, which is part of that Broadway show stuff that he's directed. I've only seen one of his documentaries, 4 Little Girls, and that was part of the process for this. I've seen John Leguizamo's Freak, and I've seen a play that he just directed called Passover, which I highly recommend. It's fascinating. It's extremely well done. It's an interesting play, but the way he films it, he gets away with it. Like, he really can film a play, and he does it in his style, which usually you kind of have to redefine what your style is to film a live stage production. He does not. He defines the live stage production by his style. And I was blown away by it. And then there's another one that I'm watching right now called Passing Strange. It's another Broadway musical that he filmed, a band telling stories. So I'm in the middle of watching that. And I'm in the middle of watching Malcolm X again. I'm only halfway through. But for this podcast, because I'm pretty proud of this, I saw She's Gotta Have It. He Got Game for the first time and never saw that. Bamboozled again.
Yeah.
Whoa. Like, wow. School Days again. Mo Better Blues again. 25th Hour. And then Passover. So those are the films that I actually reached out and wanted to see before. Now, there's also 2 films on his list, Get on the Bus and another one, which when I watched the trailers, I was like, have I seen those movies? When I saw the trailer for Get on the Bus, I was like, wait, I do remember the Black Republican. I do remember the 2 gay guys. I do remember the son. I was like, have I seen this movie? But I didn't want to add it just in case. So yeah, you're right. He is prolific. He is profound. He is stylistically unique. His thumbprint is only his. And we're going to talk about a category later on where he was hired to direct movies, not necessarily write or direct. And what he's done is he puts his thumbprint on whatever he does, but he also stands out of the way of the story. He never allows his Spike Lee-isms to get in the way of the story, ever. Now, sometimes they are so theatrically over the top that it adds to something in the movie, but when he's a gun for hire, he stays out of the way.
Really, that's the one thing that when you look at other auteurs, which that's what we're talking about. We're talking about an auteur. We're talking about someone who, you're right, has a thumbprint. There are certain things, whether it's who he chooses for the score, which is usually either his dad in his earlier career or Terrence Blanchard throughout the rest of his career, or whether it's his choice of types of shots or technology used when shooting the film, or cast even to a certain extent. But he has a particular feeling to his films, and that's kind of the definition of an auteur. And so that is kind of what we're kind of honing in on here. But one thing I've noticed about Spike Lee is more to your point, that where he has the ability to kind of morph and change and allow himself to be put in different situations, whether it's documentaries. I mean, you look at the other people that we talk about a lot on this podcast, whether it's Stanley Kubrick or Paul Thomas Anderson or David Fincher, one of my favorites. I mean, these guys are very specific. Quentin Tarantino has even gone to the extent that he said, I'm only going to direct 10 movies. Like, he's very precious with his oeuvre and very precious with, like, this is going to be my stable of films. Whereas it seems like Spike Lee is like, there's the line in Heat, the Michael Mann film, where I think it was like Waingro, one of the characters, it was the Tom Sizemore character, says, the action is the juice. And it seems like that's what I feel like Spike Lee feels like, is that like the act of creating this art is the payback, as opposed to sitting back when you're retired and being Quentin Tarantino and having 10 movies and people talking about your 10 movies. Like, he's more interested, it seems like Spike Lee's more interested in getting out there and doing the thing and putting it out there and making it engaging. And so that's the thing that really interests me, to where he's able to shift from a feature-length film to a documentary that comes out on HBO about the levees breaking in New Orleans, or a Nike commercial, or whatever it is. He's able to kind of shift and change and move into all these different arenas, but then also still keep his essence in with all of those. Whereas if we were talking about somebody like Stanley Kubrick, you wouldn't necessarily have seen somebody like that back in his time directing commercials or whatever. But now there's a bunch of different options for filmmakers out there, or for artists out there. So I think that we should probably start with his kind of focus on where he grew up. And he even though Spike Lee, who was born Shelton Jackson Lee in Atlanta, he moved to Brooklyn when he was fairly young, and he grew up there, and he's made 6 films about Brooklyn, one of which I saw on your recommendation, Crooklyn. So, which, I mean, dang, man, that has an amazing soundtrack. So that's a period piece set in the 70s, early 70s, and it's set in Brooklyn. It's a somewhat autobiographical film written by him, his sister, and his brother. And so it goes through a bunch of different things, but it's set essentially in Brooklyn. It shares this kind of grouping with 5 other films that Spike Lee has called his Chronicles of Brooklyn. And those are She's Gotta Have It, Do the Right Thing, Clockers, Jungle Fever, and Red Hook Summer. So a lot of these were made earlier on in his career, and She's Gotta Have It is his first full feature-length film. He did a movie that was about an hour long as his master's thesis when he was at New York's Tisch School of the Arts, but really, She's Gotta Have It is his first feature-length film. And so each of these films focus on Brooklyn specifically, and his most famous is Do the Right Thing. And it can't go understated the impact I think that had on film and even the Oscars. I mean, wasn't there was kind of like a somewhat of a dust-up during the Oscar ceremony with Kim Basinger, who announced all of the different nominees for Best Picture, which back then there were only 5. And as she announced all of them, she said that one was missing, and it was Do the Right Thing. So, I mean, it does have somewhat of a history. He was nominated for screenplay for that, correct?
Yeah, that's the only one. And I believe Danny Aiello was nominated for supporting actor. And I think that's it. But don't quote me on that. I'm pretty sure.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Would you say that's his most revered work? Do the Right Thing?
Well, I don't know if it's his most revered at this point. And by the way, side note to what you were saying about him being prolific, the thing that defines that for me is the fact that he keeps getting better. So he's not relying on 3 or 4 films when he was younger and he's just making the same thing over and over again just to make films, just to keep in the business. He's not doing that. The Five Bloods and Black Klansman, those are some of his best. And they are in the last 2.5 years, 3 years. So he just keeps getting more interesting. He allows the subject to become the subject, not the director becomes the subject or the actors become the subject. The subject is important. And he has begged back on some of his style in certain things, and he's added a lot of his style in other things, and it seems to work. So he creates a lot. And I love the whole idea of juice and, action and working and just creating. But he is not just standing still. He is actually getting more interesting. So it's going to be interesting in 10 years what he's done. So yes, I would say Do the Right Thing is what he is known for, meaning if you were to say Spike Lee to somebody, can you name a Spike Lee movie? Do the Right Thing. And there was a lot of controversy with that film. Unfortunately, there was a kerfuffle during the Cannes Film Festival Awards. But the other controversy was that there was violence around the film. And that if you went to go see this film, it was promoting violence. And that people were standing outside of theaters and beating people up because you went to go see Do the Right Thing. And I was like, what is happening? And I actually remember being afraid to see that film in the theater because of the controversy. Then Jungle Fever came out. And I was like, I love this guy. I'm seeing his movie in the theater. I don't care what happens. And then an education on certain subjects started to happen for me. I realized that people make up stories for a lot of different reasons, because of systemic reasons, because of systemic racism, because people can't handle a young Black man making really great films and making money at it, because Do the Right Thing was financially sound and Jungle Fever was financially sound. Malcolm X was financially sound. But I also realized that it's just like The Last Temptation of Christ. I was afraid at first to see that movie because there was a controversy and there were people picketing it and people standing out and saying, you don't really believe in God if you see this movie, and there's not the right Christ in that movie, and they say he has the devil in him and all this other stuff. And then I saw the movie and I was like, you have to see the movie, because he does say that. He does say the devil's inside him, but not for the reason why everybody has stood out with picket signs. So from that point on, I was never afraid of anything that anybody put out if there was a controversy behind it, because I refuse to be stifled in what I want to see because somebody is saying it's going to promote something. And I'm like, did you see Do the Right Thing? You're missing the point if you think his idea was to promote violence. You're missing the point. Mm-hmm. The violence exists. He's pointing it out. Art imitates life, not the opposite way around. And anything that comes up around it is fabricated for somebody else's
agenda.
Yeah, perfect word. So anyway, the point to all that is that, yes, I think Do the Right Thing is the touchstone, but I don't think it's all he is, luckily. But it's a pretty damn good movie.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really good.
So would you say for someone who hasn't seen any Spike Lee movies, would you say that Do the Right Thing is a good place to start?
Yep.
Yeah, I agree.
I would immediately say Do the Right Thing, Crooklyn, 25th Hour, Inside Man, Defy Bloods. And then if you really wanted to explore, Bamboozled, because it will bamboozle your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend that immediately unless it was somebody like who really is into film and just have never explored Spike Lee. But if you want to jump into it, you can jump into Bamboozled, but you are jumping into it.
Yeah, we'll have to get to Bamboozled in a little bit because
on.
That's a whole discussion. I think that Bamboozled is a challenging film in more ways than one. But yeah, as far as Do the Right Thing is concerned, I agree. I think that it's a good starting point in that it is hyper stylized. It seems like everyone is hitting on all cylinders. Director of photography is Ernest Dickerson, who Spike Lee went to school with at the New York School of the Arts. And the score is great. The acting is amazing. Every piece of that film, it doesn't pull punches. The writing is pointed and is precise. And it's actually so well written. And when I look at it compared to She's Gotta Have It was 86 and Do the Right Thing was 89. So it was only 3 years earlier. The difference in the writing from She's Gotta Have It and Do the Right Thing is astronomical. Now, I haven't seen School Days, so I can't speak to that. But I saw She's Gotta Have It recently for the first time. And I have to say that the writing was subpar. And it really stuck out, especially compared to all the other Spike Lee films that I watched over the last month or so. And I was kind of amazed at how he improved in his script writing in those 3 years. How did you like She's Gotta Have It? Was the first time you saw it?
That I remember seeing it all the way through.
Yeah.
It's a tough movie. It's raw. It's a first film.
Yeah. Oh, it was shot in 2 weeks too, which after I found that out after I watched it, and I was like, wow, that is super difficult. So I think it suffers from, I think, a weak script and some really tough acting choices. But other than that, like there's a lot of that style. The opening of the film is very similar to the openings of a lot of his documentaries. And we see that kind of pastiche single frame, like shots over amazingly recorded and performed jazz music. The score was amazing on She's Gotta Have It, but there were some really tough spots that stuck out to me.
I was very much Josh Knapp on my notes for this podcast. I actually wrote down notes about She's Gotta Have It. So here's what I said. I said, I think it looks great. It looks fantastic. Yeah. It's very grainy and raw. It's very cool. The opening sequence, like you just said, it sets the bar for everything else that he's done. And it's almost like I would like to have, those frames, those picture frames where you can put photographs that actually change and you can go from one photograph to the other. I would like one of those frames on my shelf just showing the opening sequences of Spike Lee movies. Each frame would have a different opening sequence because they're amazing. They're films in themselves. Mm-hmm. They tell a story in 2 minutes that if you really connect the dots later on, you realize he's told you the story in the opening sequences of these films. So it looks great. The shots of New York are amazing in She's Gotta Have It. There's some of the best shots of New York I've ever seen. That still photography thing that he does that looks like it's a still picture, but it's not. It's an actual frame of a film moving. And he does that in He Got Game where it's actually people posed, but they look like it's a still shot. I love that. I love the way he lights those things with that really stark, hard white light coming from one side. It looks fake as hell, but it also is stylistic. It doesn't look like anything in real life. And I think that's important. I actually think the dialogue in She's Gotta Have It, it's not as bad as you're talking about. I think it's a great step in the direction of what he does, and he has improved immediately in 2 different films after that. But I actually think it's the acting that's the main issue in that film.
Okay.
And because this time I was really listening to the dialogue because I had seen so many other things up to that point. And then I watch School Days and I'm paying attention to the dialogue. And I think he says interesting things and She's Gotta Have It. It's just, it doesn't read well because of the first time actors.
Yeah.
It just doesn't read well. I would like to see a stage reading of She's Gotta Have It with the actors he has now.
Oh.
And I think it might improve in your eyes.
And it would work as a stage play.
Yeah, 100%. So now he's going to direct a Broadway show and maybe that's it. And he's going to win a Tony and we said it first. I'm just saying. The use of music was from the very beginning. She's Gotta Have It's got a great soundtrack, and the way that he uses the music, and he loves jazz, obviously, and the way he uses it, so not boring.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not saying jazz is boring. I'm not one of those people. I think jazz is really exciting, but it can seem mundane. It can seem repetitive. It can seem without purpose. There's trumpets and horns in places you're not expecting. There's squeals of tires that turn into flutes. I mean, it's amazing. The sound in She's Gotta Have It is great. And also, that was the beginning of his fourth wall breaking. He breaks the fourth wall quite a bit in that film. And I think what he learned, and this is complete conjecture, I have no way of knowing it. I think he learned, maybe I should beg back on that and not do it as much. Because when I do it, and at the end of Jungle Fever, when he turns to the camera and screams, it's much more effective than people speaking to the camera the whole entire time. At the end of School Days, wake up. Wake up is a theme in Spike Lee's films, and I believe it began in School Days. But there's a shot, a dolly shot of Lawrence Fishburne. He starts to float up, and he just goes, wake up. And he's facing the fourth wall. And it's really profound. But it's the only time in the film that I think he does it. I think there might be another shot or two of breaking the fourth wall, but She's Gotta Have It, he does it all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's a mistake. If he's not a mistake, just an interesting choice that I don't know adds to it. Like, if they were just being interviewed as characters, that would be different. But they're talking to the camera if you're a character in the film.
It's faux documentary. I mean, it's kind of like The Office or whatever other movie, Parks and Rec, whatever. I mean, that's kind of what they're going for. They're not hiding the fact that they're speaking to the camera. And I think that works. It can work in a film, but just the fact that they only had 2 weeks to shoot it, I mean, that's a colossal undertaking right there.
You watch that film and you can see if and when he walked into an executive office with that film to show them this is what I can do, I can see why somebody would give him money for his next movie. Yeah. There's so much potential and so many interesting things, and She's Gotta Have It, that I just believe the actors were trying to remember their lines. And, I have a sympathy for that because I know what that's like. And there's a couple of monologues in that where you can tell they're just happy they got through the lines. And when you're talking about 2 weeks worth of work, but the other stuff that's in that film, you can see how if somebody was smart and knew the art form, they would give that man money for his next film. Yeah, and they did.
They did.
And he made School Days.
Yeah. And I mean, even if you focus it even down to the sex scenes, so there's essentially 3 paramours for the main character, and there's 3 sex scenes, and each of them are completely different. I think there's 4 sex scenes totally, but each of them are completely different, and he utilizes different styles for each of them. And some of them are French cinema based, kind of like the, Truffaut Godard based. Some of them are just more clinical, and some of them are very kind of like floaty camera. And so he's able to take something that is essentially the same action, but then completely reframe it in different ways and make it interesting from a cinematic standpoint. Those are the things that you kind of look at and you're like, he's right out of school and he's doing this kind of stuff. Imagine what, how it can be developed as his career goes on. And we've obviously seen that. I did watch Mo Better Blues again, which I'm just going to drop in here and say, as someone who's played in jazz combos and jazz bands, and who's a musician, even though I haven't really played trombone in a long time, I'm very sensitive to people acting on screen as if they're playing an instrument. And I do know that Denzel Washington and Wesley Snipes are not a trumpeter and saxophonist, respectively. And they both looked great in this film. And I think a lot of it has to do with the attention to detail that Spike Lee gave to those particular things and the dedication of those actors to make sure that they actually knew how to act like they were really playing these instruments. And Mo Better Blues, to me, is also mentionable as far as, number one, it's the first time that he worked with Denzel Washington. And number two, it's the first time that he got Terrence Blanchard involved in his filmmaking. At this point, his dad, Bill Lee, was the composer of the film, but Terrence Blanchard was the performer of all of the jazz pieces that the Denzel Washington character Bleak played in the film. So I think from that moment on, Terrence Blanchard pretty much like has handled most of his scores.
No, the introduction, the opening sequence of Mo Better Blues is his best opening sequence. I've spoken.
Interesting.
I mean, and that's hard pressed to say. It's hard pressed to say that because the opening of The Five Bloods is great. The opening of Black Klansman is great. The opening of Do the Right Thing is great. The opening of Jungle Fever is great. But there is something so stylistically correct about the choice of that slow pan down the trumpet, because you don't really know what it is at first. You're really not sure what it is. And then when it finally comes into focus, you're like, this whole entire time I've been watching a trumpet and did not know what it was. And that blue background, it's beautiful. It's my favorite opening sequence. And I have been watching, there's a whole thing on YouTube where you can watch all of his opening sequences. And I'm sure that's the truth for many directors.
Yeah.
But I actually think, like I said before, his opening sequences and his title credit sequences are mini movies in themselves. And you learn everything you need to know about that movie in just that slow pan down that trumpet. Yeah, and I don't understand what Denzel is doing in that movie. I am not a musician, but I am very hypersensitive to like somebody dialing the wrong amount of numbers on a phone, somebody smoking and not really inhaling. I'm hypersensitive to things like that. You're smoking weed and you can tell when somebody is like really doing it well and when somebody's not. Just by their hand positions and stuff like that. Well, I mean, those things stick out to me. Like when I see somebody as a surgeon cutting something and you can just tell they've never held that instrument before. So anyway, when Spike Lee does that dolly shot early on in the film and Denzel's moving his fingers and he's practicing, but he's not playing, I don't understand it. Like that level of imitation is why Denzel is who he is. And that bar is so high.
I think that first of all, it makes sense that someone like Denzel Washington, who's been, I mean, at this point, he's been professionally acting for over a decade. And I'm assuming he has a certain amount of obsession as far as his acting craft is concerned. And it's the same type of obsession as someone would have who's a professional musician, someone who is regimented and that comes in later, obviously, in the film, as far as like he's regimented in the fact that he practices for a certain number of hours per day, and it's something that is not negotiable, and it is an obsession, and it's something that when it's not satisfied, he's just not a complete human. And that's, I'm sure that Denzel Washington as an actor could identify with that. It's just a different art form.
Yeah, think about that for a split second though, what you just said, and then we'll move on to Crooklyn. He is obsessed with being an actor and getting the acting part down. So inside that, he has to be obsessed about being a trumpet player and get that down. Inside that, he has to be obsessed with dialogue and marks and positions on top of all of that. I would venture to say it's not more complicated than any other art form, but it's as complicated. And I don't think many people think of it that way. Like if you saw a trumpet player rehearsing, you could respect the dedication and the practice it takes. You can see the technique. With acting, I'm not sure people do. So he has all of that, plus had to pretend like he really was a professional musician. Crazy. That seems mind-boggling to me. I've watched it 1,000 times. Well, 1,000 times, hyperbolic. I watched it a handful of times, and I cannot not see his fingers not move in the right position. I'm not saying I understand the position he's supposed to have, but it looks like he's playing what he's doing. Oh, another good thing other than smoking weed is piano playing in movies. When somebody's hands are not doing the right thing, it's the worst. Or when the camera turns away from something complicated, the actor's not doing that. Now they can just chop your hands off and use a computer generated thing. You're fine.
That's true.
But
well, I mean, and actually Giancarlo Esposito is the piano player in this film, and he does pretty good. But I think that Denzel Washington is like dead nuts on. Like he is seriously on. And actually, it's very similar to Chadwick Boseman in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom that just came out within this last year. He was very specific as to how he portrayed a trumpet player on screen, and I think it's a very similar thing, and it shouldn't go unnoticed that Denzel Washington was a producer on that film. So I'm sure, hopefully there was some sort of a back and forth between them and Denzel Washington being like, I've been there, man. Like, I totally know what it's like to try to portray a trumpet player on screen faithfully. And it's got to be really difficult. All right, well, let's talk about Crooklyn. Why did you want me to see this film, considering there's so many other Spike Lee movies? Why is it this film was the one that I absolutely had to see for this episode?
Because it's one of my favorites. It just touches me in a way that a lot. It's not that his other films don't touch me, but I have a personal connection to that film. I can't explain it any better than I actually met Spike Lee on Hollywood Boulevard when he was, well, not on Hollywood Boulevard. He was filming Girl 6 on Hollywood Boulevard. There's a sequence at the end when she's standing in front of Mann's Chinese Theater, or Mann's Theater now. And I was working at a restaurant called Hamburger Hamlet. I laugh every time I think of that. Hamburger Hamlet. So ridiculous.
Did you say to cheese or not to cheese?
No, but I really wish I would have. I met Quentin Tarantino there too. John Voight there. I met Spike Lee. He walked through. And I said, hey, Crooklyn is one of my favorite movies. And it stopped him. And he's working. So I didn't want to be like that guy. But he walked right past me and it just came out. I love Crooklyn. I said, he stopped. And he was like, oh yeah? And I was like, yeah, I had kind of the opposite effect. And he goes, what do you mean? And I go, well, I was raised in Virginia and we went up to the north to spend our summers up north. And that scrunching thing, that ratio thing you do, now I know it's ratio. I didn't know it then. I said that scrunching thing you do with the film, that's exactly what a little kid feels like when they have to travel outside their environment to a whole nother environment. So imagine me going from the south to the north for only 6 weeks out of the year, what it felt like. And that scrunching of the film felt like that. So even though I was not a young African-American female growing up in Brooklyn, coming of age story, by this point I was 20-something-year-old white guy. I had nothing to relate to that little girl about other than I remember feeling that way when I was a kid. I remember being misunderstood in my family as a kid. I remember being so confused of all of the bings and whistles of the North. And then she went down to the South and there was none of that. It's always quiet at night, the crickets and everything. It must have drove her crazy. So something about the whole idea of, and plus it's the 70s and the TV shows that they watched in that movie, I watched when I was a kid. And I don't come from a big family. My immediate family, I have an older brother and a younger sister, but I have 49 first cousins, all up in Philadelphia, all up in northern Philadelphia. Yeah. So there's a lot of us. So I know what it's like to like fight for a cupcake and fight for a donut in the morning. And that's not entirely true. I always got my donuts. Somebody always took care of me. But I remember what it was like. Alfre Woodard reminded me of my mother. Is that TV on in there? No. And then you see him whispering and quietly singing along with the Partridge Family. I remember stuff like that as a kid. So maybe it's because I have a personal connection to that film. But I also think it's one of those movies that most people jump over when they talk about Spike Lee. Most people recommend Jungle Fever or Malcolm X or something else. So I just think it's one of those movies that touches me personally, and I just want other people to experience it. So that I think that's why I recommended it. So how'd you feel about it?
I'm glad that you did recommend it because I would have jumped over that film because I would have said like, oh, it's another Brooklyn movie. I've already seen Do the Right Thing. I mean, I totally get it. I'll just move on. And I'm really glad that I didn't because I was kind of taken aback at the kind of environment that was created by. It's kind of interesting that in Brooklyn, I guess it's probably pretty easy to turn a particular block into a block from the 70s because maybe nothing had changed in the 20-something years that had passed between there as far as the architecture is concerned. But you shove it full of 70s cars and people in 70s wardrobe, and you just fill it with these amazing songs from the time and all of these cultural touchstones from the time, and you're able to invoke a period of time that I never lived in, that I never experienced, and that I don't really have a connection to, but I feel like it was a lived-in area. And I also saw a family that was working together as a family, but nobody knew how to figure it out, and everybody was frustrated. And it was like kind of the opposite of the Partridge Family. It was the opposite of a kind of like Hollywood family, and it grounded the film in realism, but then it also gave you a central character to focus on. And so you're able to kind of focus in on a particular person within this environment, but then there's all these ancillary characters that I don't know if they were based on real people or what. I definitely have questions about a lot of the characters, but and then I saw RuPaul in there for a second. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on, but ultimately he's honing his filmmaking. And you're right, he does use the dolly, his signature locked dolly shot where the character is connected to the dolly and the dolly is moving through a scene multiple times in the film. Once is where him and his huffing buddy are upside down, and it's supposed to give that feeling of, I guess, they're high on whippets or whatever it is, spray paint. I guess it's spray paint because they have like some sort of like silver spray paint around their lips or something. And then she's in that whole scene later on where she's in a dream and and they've like forced her to do this huffing or whatever. But yeah, invoking that trick for her and then paying it off at the very end. I don't want to necessarily ruin it for anybody, but it definitely gets paid off at the end of the film too. He uses it 3 separate times, which is definitely a thing in filmmaking, a triptych type of a device. And so that I thought was really cool. And then just to bring up more filmmaking tricks, which I would have never even thought about. And what you alluded to earlier was, you're right, there's something associated with aspect ratio, but it really isn't aspect ratio. It's still in Academy, so it's still widescreen. The film is still widescreen, but it's shot with an anamorphic lens. So it's shot with this lens that's meant to be stretched out in post-production. But what he chose to do was not stretch it out in post-production and just take that unstretched film and keep it unstretched so that everybody's super skinny down in, were they in Virginia? I guess, yeah. I can't remember. Yeah. Down in Virginia, and any scenes when she's down in Virginia is in that squeezed, anamorphic, non-stretched version, and then everything in Brooklyn is normal, as quote unquote normal, as we would say. So yeah, I thought that was just, first of all, just an amazing choice. And those are the things that's why Spike Lee, I guess that's something that I would never think about, because from an engineer's brain, that's wrong. That's improper. That's incorrect. Like, you just don't do that. But when you see it on film, you are confronted with a new reality. And that is, I think, what he's going for. He's confronting you with a new reality, and he's forcing you into her point of view. And those are the tools that he has. He's menacing the audience in a very gentle way, but he's menacing the audience to the point where I did a little bit of research on this, and people who had seen the film went to the management after seeing the film and said, there's something wrong with your movie. There's a portion in the movie that doesn't look right, and I think you need to fix it. So that a lot of movie theaters would post outside of the theater that there's a portion of the film that may look awkward or may look different than you're used to. It's part of the film. It's normal. And so they're confronting people, even going into the film, that there's going to be something that's not just right, and you're going to have to deal with it.
Bold choices will win with me every time. Even if the bold choice doesn't work, the fact that you make a bold choice is impressive to me. And what I would think most filmmakers would do, and I'm just guessing from just seeing movies my whole entire life, my guess would be most filmmakers would scrunch the film as she arrives in Virginia and then eventually let it open back up to your normal, but he doesn't. And that whole sequence in Virginia is scrunched the whole time. And it's unnerving and it's uncomfortable and it's unexpected. But when she leaves and it unscrunches, there is a feeling of relief because she's going home and you can sense it. It's a visceral event. You actually go, oh, okay, back to where she belongs. because she doesn't belong there. Although it becomes like every other going to camp for the summer or whatever. You don't want to go, and then once you go, you don't want to come home because it's really different and unique, and she bonded with her cousins down there and so forth and so on. So anybody who makes those kind of choices in movies or in theater or wherever, music, I'm always about that. But he held on to it. He didn't hesitate to stand strong. And that sequence is long. It's not short. It's a whole mini film inside of it. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you enjoyed that film, because it is the movie people look over. But I also think it's one of his most personal. And I also think when you go from She's Gotta Have It, School Days, Do the Right Thing, and I'm not sure what's in between there.
Mo Better
Jungle
Blues.
Fever's in between there. And then Mo Better Blues is in between there. All of those are of subjects you would expect or seemingly expect Spike Lee to be interested in. A coming of age story about a 10-year-old girl who goes down to Virginia for the summer and lives with parents that are just making it. You wouldn't necessarily think that would be something he would be attracted to, but it's about the storytelling process, not about the subjects. And that appeals to me.
Yeah.
That he can just all of a sudden take a right turn and talk about a 10-year-old little girl. By the way, she's Denzel Washington's daughter in He Got Game. So she's actually
cool.
a recurring character or a recurring actor for Spike Lee, at least twice so
Well,
far.
he definitely does that, where he finds actors and he will use them multiple times throughout his career. So, Crooklyn is a period piece, much like Malcolm X and Summer of Sam, and even a movie that we did a podcast on a few years ago, Black Klansman. And I think that it's interesting that he doesn't shy away from period pieces, but Malcolm X as an undertaking is huge. And his journey to that film is interesting in that it was initially a film that the rights for Alex Haley's autobiography of Malcolm X were bought, and the production was started with Norman Jewison as the director, and he's the one who got Denzel Washington on board. But once the project was announced, there was a backlash from a lot of people that said that, should someone who's not an African-American filmmaker helm this film? And Spike Lee was one of the people who supported that challenge. So for various reasons, Norman Jewison stepped down as director, not necessarily only because of that, I don't think, but Spike Lee was approached to make the film, and he did. Now, the production of the film was fraught. There were all kinds of things that they were trying to reel them back on. Like the producers didn't want to allow the production to go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the iconic scenes in the film, I think. And it's very important to the character of Malcolm X, the fact that we get to see as an audience how that pilgrimage to Mecca affects Malcolm X at that point in his life. And I feel like if they weren't able to do that, the film would have suffered because of that. And I think they also wanted the movie to be shorter. I think that there was in the contract, it was like the movie needs to be 2 hours and 15 minutes long. Well, this movie is not 2 hours and 15 minutes long. This is a long movie. And when you look at the scope of the film, to me, it seems daunting. And I think that the responsibility that it sounds like Spike Lee took on, which was trying to represent a complex person, and throughout his whole life, it seemed like it would have been pretty much an impossible task. But it's a very well-made film, and it doesn't shy away from any part of Malcolm X's life. I did rewatch this movie recently, and Denzel Washington is just like unstoppable. And even seeing recently One Night in Miami and hearing the recording of Malcolm X in Judas and the Black Messiah, all of that coming together within the last year, and rewatching Malcolm X, I was kind of amazed at how, once again, Denzel Washington is able to just like sink into this other thing.
When you were talking about the Denzel Washington and hearing Malcolm X and Judas and the Black Messiah, do you remember I actually questioned whether or not that was really Malcolm X or was that Denzel Washington? Remember we talked about, could they not get the rights? Did they just use Denzel Washington? Because, well, first of all, naturally, Denzel Washington has the same cadence in his voice, just naturally. So it was a meant to be. As for any kind of controversy over any kind of director, in my personal opinion, I would never venture to say somebody shouldn't direct a movie because of a certain reason, whatever that reason may be. A woman shouldn't direct a movie about a man shouldn't direct a movie about a lesbian, whatever it may be. But this particular story, I actually think that it was smarter to have a black man helmet. Because if you've read the book, it spends an enormous amount of time talking about the white devil. And it's in the movie, but it's sewn in there differently. There are chapter after chapter after chapter of examples of in our society where a black man could get the impression that the white man is the devil. And you can see that through their eyes. And you can also see that from that part of that story, whatever the story may be, the shop owner who was ripping off the black employees, or the shop owner who was allowing somebody to work more than 25 extra hours without paying them overtime, whatever the example in the book is, you can see how at the end of somebody's life, how they could actually look at, in particular, the white man and call him the devil, because all of these things did happen. So do I think a white man can't direct that? No, I don't think that per se. But I do think a black man would come with a sensibility that might take a white guy a lot longer to research to come to. And I'm kind of glad that Spike Lee was the choice. And here's why. Regardless of everything I just said, none of that is interesting to me. What is interesting is how he adapted for the screen hundreds of pages of this autobiography, which I think is one of the best autobiographies I've ever read. It's very entertaining. It's enlightening. It has a spiritual presence to it. You get the idea of what the character's like in the beginning of his life. You get you understand why the character transitions and how he transitions issues into the Nation of Islam. You understand all of the stuff because it's so well etched out, but it's not boring like a history book. This happened in 1976 to Malcolm on the streets of Boston. It's not like that. It's really entertaining, but also very drastic and very dark and very sinister, but there's a levity to it also. And so I was thinking about this the other day after I watched about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes of Malcolm X again. And I was trying to compare it to the book because I just finished the book a little while ago. And there's a whole chapter about those zoot suits that they wear in the beginning of the film with the plume and the hats and the shoes. There's a whole paragraph about shoes and the idea that this was a symbol of where you're at in this society. If you had this specific zoot suit, and he liked the orange one with the pinstripes and the big plume that went out of it, and it was a status symbol. Well, how do you do all of that and figure all of that out in a film that's 3.5 hours long without making it 7 hours long? You put levity in it. You make it a dance sequence, for lack of a better term, because when they do that keep on trucking dance down the street where they kind of are strutting when they're kind of leaned over, that doesn't happen in the book, but it explains how important, how they felt when they were wearing those suits and how they impressed upon people around them who they were by wearing those suits. People parted ways when they came down the streets in those suits. And then the dance halls and the dance sequences in the movie are very minimal. But in the book, it's a whole thing. It's like epic in the book. It's years. And him actually knowing Billie Holiday and being friends with Billie Holiday, which is a very small snippet in the movie. But how do you do that? How do you make it relevant? You make it a dance sequence that you see that when these young people come together, this was the important part of their life for that night. And it's juxtaposed to everything else that they've done. All the drugs, all the women, all of the pork eating, all of the sleeping with white women that they do, all of the stuff that they do around that all happens around that ballroom. You have to condense it to one dance sequence that lets everybody know that there's a status to being the main person on the dance floor. And that Malcolm X was that at the time, that he was top tier of his social environment by that dance sequence. To me, that's brilliant. And how quickly he jumps into the Nation of Islam and transitions from one thing to the next could be very tonally hard to do, but he does it really well. He changes some of the facts to get that done, but it still is,
Well,
it's still well done.
he utilizes, see, this is where Spike Lee is a genius. He utilizes a tool of filmmaking. He utilizes Malcolm Little's hair, because as a part of that
Right.
Zoot Suit scene, it's him straightening his hair. They're markers in his life. The first time he straightens his hair is when we were introduced to him. Second time he straightens his hair is when he goes to jail. The third time he straightens his hair is when he meets the first person that he meets who is a part of Nation of Islam and who ultimately recruits him into the Nation of Islam. And so that is when he's confronted with the act of what he's doing by straightening his hair, is he's denying his hair's natural state. And then he's able to utilize that as a way to move him into the Nation of Islam. So it's a filmmaking device. It's a storytelling device. And it's natural. That's why the tone doesn't grate. That's why it flows. That's why this film, this 3.5 hour long movie, flows. And it's really difficult to do. The other thing I noticed when I watched the film this last time is that the filmmaking style, the colors are very saturated and deep. Like the blacks are really black. The chrome on the cars is really shiny. The lighting choices are somewhat extreme in some cases and unnatural, but they feel rich. Everything feels rich, even in the later scenes. And then he also does what he does very often in his films, is where he mixes media, and he does this in The Five Bloods too, where he'll shoot 4K video or 8K video and, pristine, super amazing high definition stuff. And then he'll shoot 16 millimeter, or he'll shoot 8 millimeter film, handheld 8 millimeter film, and he'll mix together all of those things. Or he'll show old footage from actual protests or found footage type things from real life and interweave that into the films that he's talking about. And actually, he makes stylistic choices in Inside Man also, where he will hypersaturate a film and degrade the film down to a very grainy version of it. And so he's able to mix all of these things, and he's kind of pushing that tone back and forth. And he's also showing you that you're in a different place and time in the film, or that you're focusing on a character at a particular situation in their life, or that this fictional film is tying into real life. Now, Malcolm X is a little different because obviously it's a real person that really lived in a real time, and we're able to kind of switch back and forth between this type of archival footage and the footage that he's shooting. But really at the end of Malcolm X, there's an Ossie Davis voiceover, and they show footage of Malcolm X. And so it makes it's a lot more effective. It was a heavy lift doing a movie about Malcolm X, but it seems like he was able to navigate the production issues and then make a film that he's proud of, which had to be really difficult.
Well, it's entertaining and it's historically accurate enough to the point where there are significant things that happen in the book that aren't necessarily something you need to put into the movie. For example, when he goes to Mecca in the book, it takes him weeks. He's locked in a room at the airport, sleeping on the floor for weeks, because you have to present why you're going to Mecca, prove that you're a true Muslim, all of these things. You have to know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, blah, 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 blah. And by that point, he has a reputation as Malcolm X in America. So that's kind of what leads him down that road. Somebody also kind of takes him under his wing. And that's how he eventually gets into Mecca. But, in a film, you don't need all of that. It's not about his journey, how he got into Mecca. It's about what happens when he goes to Mecca. So that's the important part. So it's significantly historically accurate, and it's also an entertaining movie. So I'm glad that Spike Lee helmed that film, because his thumbprint on it makes it that much more interesting to watch. And if you have to see a movie instead of read an autobiography, that one I'm okay with. Like, I would really protest. I'd be like, read the autobiography. I know it's 800 pages. Get over it. Read it. But if somebody just couldn't do it, that movie is the right substitute.